Welcome back. And if this is your first time here, I'm glad you've joined us. Before we get started, I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you're lying down in Lisbon, finishing your day in Jakarta, or dozing off in Denver, it's always a privilege to share these journeys with you. If you find yourself getting pulled into the rhythm of these stories, feel free to subscribe so we can explore more together. Now, get comfortable. Let your imagination drift back into a time of cold steel and clashing ideologies. A time of mud and blood, of rotting banners flapping above fields of the fallen. Today, we delve into the grim truth behind the battles of the medieval era. Not the glossed-over romance, but the brutal core, the chaos, the carnage, the way thousands of lives could be decided in the space of an hour. This isn't a story of shining armor and noble duels. This is survival, raw and unfiltered. War in the Middle Ages wasn't rare. It was practically a seasonal event. At its worst, it was year-round. Borders were not permanent lines. They were living tensions. A royal marriage could set off a chain of battles. A disputed title could cost entire villages. Feuds didn't just happen between kings. They bled through every level of society. Barons, clergy, towns, and farmers. And when words failed, swords were drawn. But what did an army actually look like in those days? Not the polished machine we might imagine today. Medieval armies were chaotic, improvised, and incredibly uneven. A king or duke couldn't summon a standing military at will. He had to call upon vassals, lords, and their men. Feudal levies formed the core. Knights were expected to fight for their liege for a set number of days per year. Alongside them were commoners, conscripted villagers, apprentices, blacksmiths, even thieves promised freedom for service. Then came the mercenaries. These were professional soldiers, loyal only to coin. They were feared and resented in equal measure, seen as brutal but necessary. Many were veterans of foreign wars, having fought in the Crusades or border skirmishes in Spain or Italy. They brought experience, but also a taste for pillage. For them, war was a trade, and blood was just another price. A typical medieval force was a motley crew, nobles in shining plate mail, archers in tunics and leather bracers, farmers with pitchforks and clubs. There was no standard issue gear. Wealth dictated protection. A knight might have chainmail, a steel helm, and a broadsword. His squire might carry a spear and a dagger. The town militia might have little more than sharpened farming tools. Some wore padded gambesons, others old bits of armor inherited from fathers or scavenged from the dead. Even horses varied. War horses, destriers, were trained to kick, trample, and bite. They were as much weapons as the men who rode them. But destriers were rare and expensive. Many knights rode rounceys or palfreys into battle and dismounted to fight. Infantry often bore the brunt of combat, packed into dense formations, relying on shields and tight ranks. Before battle, armies didn't have drills like modern forces. There were no synchronized salutes or rehearsed maneuvers, but they had rituals. Oaths were sworn. Priests delivered blessings. Banners were raised, depicting the heraldry of each house. Trumpets or horns sounded to signal movement. Communication on the field was limited, mostly by messengers on horseback, visual signals, or raw instinct. And then came the waiting. Hours, sometimes days, spent camped near the enemy, each side sizing the other up. Sometimes negotiations happened. Other times each waited for the other to blink. Tensions mounted. Troops went without sleep. Some drank to steel their nerves. Some prayed. Others sharpened blades over and over. When the battle finally came, it was sudden and overwhelming. Drums beat. Horns screamed. War cries echoed. Lines advanced. Bows fired. Stones flew from catapults or trebuchets. The first clash was often the deadliest. Two walls of men crashing into each other in noise and chaos. Shields splintered, spears snapped, bodies were trampled underfoot before the real fighting even began. There was little elegance in a medieval melee. Combat devolved into shoving, slashing, smashing, axes crushed helms, maces shattered ribs, swords hacked through mail and flesh alike. You couldn't see the full battlefield, only the man in front of you, the mud beneath your feet, and the blur of movement to your sides. Archers continued firing over the fray, sometimes hitting their own. Horses screamed, men fell silently or with deafening howls. And then the retreat, or the rout. Once one side began to falter, it often turned into a stampede. Panic spread fast. Lines broke, men turned and ran. Cavalry pursued, cutting down the fleeing with terrifying efficiency. Victory wasn't just about who won the push. It was about who held their nerve the longest. Many deaths happened after the main clash, during the chase. Few were spared. Afterwards, the field was littered with the dead and dying. No swift removal. Corpses were stripped of armor and valuables. Wounded men cried for water or mercy. Some were finished off by scavengers or passing soldiers. The air stank of blood, sweat, and decay. Flies arrived quickly. So did looters. Survivors counted the cost. Horses lost, weapons broken, comrades missing. Even victory tasted bitter. Nobles ransomed their captured peers if they were lucky. Commoners, if captured, were more likely to be executed or enslaved. A single battle could bankrupt a lord, collapse a rebellion, or shift the power of a kingdom. The stakes were high, the losses catastrophic. And yet, they kept fighting. Because in medieval Europe, power came from the sword. Land changed hands at sword point. Thrones were claimed by it. Justice was enforced with it. And faith, even that, marched beside armies into battle, blessing blades and damning enemies. Once the blood was spilled and the field soaked with it, there came a grim second act in every medieval conflict, the aftermath. Battle did not end when the fighting stopped. In many ways, the worst began after the shouting faded. For the survivors, wounds needed tending, if they could be. For the dying, there were no clean beds or morphine. And for the victors, there was the messy business of looting, ransoming, and deciding the fate of enemies and comrades alike. No trumpets sounded to mark the end. No peace spread like sunlight through clouds. There was only exhaustion, silence, and then groaning. The field was a sprawl of twisted limbs, fallen horses, shattered weapons. Blood pooled in hoofprints, armor steamed from the heat of flesh inside it. A knight might crawl toward his comrades, dragging a broken leg. A squire might die trying to find his lord. And above them the crows began to circle. Field hospitals, if they could be called that, were makeshift at best. They were often just tents pitched hurriedly behind the lines or near churches, staffed by monks, barbers, and anyone with a steady hand. There were no antiseptics, no sterilized tools. A barber surgeon might use the same saw on 10 men. A sharp knife and a hot iron were the main options. Amputations were common, especially for arms and legs struck by axe or arrow. A soldier would be held down while the limb was cut away and the stump cauterized with red-hot metal. Anesthetics, wine, sometimes mead, opium if you were lucky, but rare. Most bit leather straps or wood. Screams echoed long after battle ended. Infection was the killer, no one escaped. Even the smallest wound could fester. Pus, fever, delirium. Gangrene set in fast. Limbs turned black. The stench of rotting flesh was everywhere. Knights had a better chance. Not because their wounds were different, but because they were worth something. A captured noble might be ransomed for lands, titles, or gold. Some were even treated well in captivity, allowed to send messages to their families, dine separately from common prisoners. The value of a knight lay not just in his arms, but in his lineage. Killing a valuable captive was bad business. But the average man-at-arms, the archer, the levy, the camp follower turned fighter, had no such luck. If he fell wounded, he might be tended by his comrades. More likely, he was left. If enemies found him, mercy was unlikely. Time was money. and a wounded soldier was a burden. Some were dispatched with daggers to the throat. Others lay in the mud for days, dying slowly, half conscious as carrion picked at them. And looting was not a crime, it was policy. Lords sometimes promised their men the right to loot as part of their pay. Battlefields became markets of the dead. Mail was stripped off corpses, rings pried from fingers, gold teeth knocked out, helms, shields, boots, anything of value was taken. Even the dead's clothing might be peeled off, sold later as second-hand. Nothing was sacred. Soldiers learned quickly. If you wanted to survive, you had to scavenge. If you hesitated, someone else would take what was yours or kill you for it. Some of the wounded were looted while still alive. They begged for water. Instead, they were rolled onto their backs and stripped. Some tried to crawl away, clutching bleeding stumps. Others played dead to avoid attention. It didn't always work. There were stories, dark ones, of dying men buried alive with the others, too weak to resist. Then came the cleanup. In some cases, local peasants were forced to clear the bodies. They worked with handkerchiefs over their noses, dragging corpses into mass graves or burning them in pits. The smell lingered for weeks. Wolves and wild dogs arrived. So did diseases. Dysentery, typhus, even the plague if the timing was wrong. A battlefield could become a source of sickness for miles around. Sometimes the dead were identified. Lords sent heralds to collect the bodies of their kin. Banners were recovered, cleaned, and stored. But many were buried without names, heaped together by the dozen. No prayers, no rites, just a hole in the earth, and silence. And yet, the work wasn't over. Once the looting ended, once the wounded were sorted and the dead forgotten, came the business of ransoms, reports, and retaliation. If a noble was captured, messages were sent, negotiations began. Family crests were drawn. Scribes scribbled contracts. Some captives were exchanged. Others were held for years. A few never came home. Victory brought spoils, but also burdens. Castles had to be garrisoned. New lands occupied. The wounded had to be cared for or ignored. The victors returned to their estates, often poorer than when they left. War was expensive. Feeding troops, replacing armor, paying mercenaries. Many lords fell into debt. Some mortgaged lands to pay for campaigns. Others taxed their peasants until revolt brewed. And the survivors? They returned home, changed. Eyes darker, backs bent, voices quieter. They carried the smell of blood in their clothes, the tremble of battle in their sleep. Many drank to forget. Others never spoke of it again. Even those untouched by the blade felt the cost. Wives received no letters, sons returned in boxes, or not at all. Villages emptied of men, fields left unplowed, cattle untended. The ripples of battle spread far. Yet people fought again and again. Because to refuse a summons was treason, because honor demanded vengeance, because land was life, because kings gave orders and men obeyed. Some believed God was on their side. Others just hoped to live through the day. Most didn't think too much about it. They followed their banners, lifted their weapons, and stepped onto the field. Because in medieval Europe, war wasn't a choice. It was a certainty. To truly understand the brutality of medieval battles, we need to understand the men who fought them, because these weren't soldiers in a modern sense, not career professionals in uniform, not factory-trained operators of war. These were sons of soil and stone, shaped by hunger, land, and blood, bound by oaths, driven by survival, and often fueled by deeply personal reasons. To fight wasn't simply a job. It was often the only path to a name, a future, or redemption. Knighthood, the pinnacle of medieval military status, began long before a man first took up a sword in earnest. A noble-born child was molded from the age of 7. He became a page, a servant in another noble household, trained in obedience, courtesy, and the early arts of war. By 14, he was a squire, shadowing a knight into battle. learning not just how to fight, but how to serve. At 21, if deemed worthy, he was knighted. But that was the privilege of the elite. The common man? His training was life itself. A peasant boy learned to swing a hoe or axe long before he learned to write his name. He chased wolves from sheep, fought off thieves, and hauled loads that hardened his back and broke his fingers. When war came, he didn't need to be taught grit, he brought it with him. But brute strength wasn't everything. Mindset mattered. These men believed in something, even if it wasn't always noble. For some, it was loyalty to a lord, a village, a brother in arms. For others, it was vengeance, a burned farm, a murdered cousin, a slight unanswered. Some sought plunder, a chance to take what they couldn't afford. Others fought because they had no choice. Feudal obligation bound them. The alternative was punishment or shame. For knights, there was chivalry. In theory, a code of honor that spoke of bravery, courtesy, protection of the weak, and service to God. But ideals often clashed with reality. A knight might uphold his honor on the tournament field, but show little mercy in battle. War had its own rules, and they weren't always written. Religion infused everything. War was not merely sanctioned by God, it was often portrayed as his will. Crusaders were told their sins would be forgiven if they took up the cross. The church blessed weapons, priests rode with armies. They heard confessions on the eve of battle, gave last rites in the mud, and promised heaven to the dying. For many soldiers, the line between holy duty and bloodshed blurred completely. And this belief, this deeply embedded sense that killing could be righteous, gave war a terrifying fervor. Men didn't just kill for land or gold, they killed for God. And when both sides believed they were chosen, mercy became scarce. Fear, of course, was universal. Even the bravest warriors felt it. Before battle, men paced, vomited, whispered prayers. Some fled, deserters who ran in the night, or vanished before the horns blew. But most stayed. They stayed not because they were fearless, but because they had learned to choke fear down, because behind them stood their comrades, because turning away would mean disgrace, because they had nowhere else to go. And when the fight began, something changed. The thinking stopped. The body took over. Rage, instinct, and training, whatever that looked like, surged. A man might scream a war cry he'd never used before. He might see red, forget pain, ignore wounds, or he might go silent, eyes flat, focused on one thing, surviving the next minute. The transformation wasn't always dramatic. Some fought methodically, others frantically, but almost all who lived through it described battle the same way, as chaos, as noise, as mud and limbs and metal. There was no glory in the moment, only struggle. And after? Those who made it through carried something invisible, a scar deeper than steel. Some coped through silence, others through storytelling, laughter, or drink. Many became harder, colder. A few found pride, others only guilt. The mindset of the medieval warrior was not built in a day. It was the product of culture, class, religion, fear, and necessity. It was sustained by stories, by rituals, by promises of eternal reward or vengeance fulfilled. And for centuries, this mindset kept the cycle going. Because so long as war was seen, not just as a necessity, but as a path to virtue, it was never far away. To truly grasp the savagery of medieval battle, we have to take a long, close look at the weapons. Not as props of legend or museum pieces under glass, but as instruments of real, intimate violence. These tools weren't designed to intimidate, they were made to kill. To break the body, the spirit, and the enemy's will. Every dented blade and splintered shaft carried the memory of blood. Let's begin with the sword. Often revered, always symbolic. But in truth, it was just one of many tools. A knight's sword, sometimes called an arming sword or longsword, was a double-edged weapon built for both slashing and thrusting. Most were around 35 to 45 inches in length, with steel blades, cruciform hilts, and worn leather grips. To wield one effectively required more than brute strength. It demanded training, timing, and muscle memory. A clumsy swing could leave a man open, or worse, lodged in a shield or opponent. Swords were personal, passed down through generations, named, inscribed with prayers or curses. Some bore Latin blessings. Others were forged with secret alloys, quenched in oil or blood, made by smiths whose work was legendary. Yet most warriors never owned one. They were expensive. For every sword on the battlefield, there were dozens of axes, spears, or clubs. The axe, simple, brutal, and devastating, was a weapon of the people. Viking raiders favored them, but so did later foot soldiers, and even mounted knights. The bearded axe, with its curved blade, was perfect for hooking behind a shield or helm. It didn't just cut, it wrenched, it shattered. Some axes were double-headed, some were attached to long hafts for reach. All were designed to cleave flesh and crack bone. Then came the blunt weapons. The mace, the flail, the morning star. These weren't graceful, they were punishing. A mace, little more than a heavy metal head atop a wooden or metal shaft, could crush a helmet, deform armor, and leave a man bleeding internally, gasping and stunned. The flail, with its swinging spiked head, was unpredictable and chaotic. The morning star, spiked and savage, could bypass traditional defenses. One strike could open a skull. Why so many blunt weapons? Because of armor. As protective gear improved, so too did the need to damage what lay underneath. You didn't need to pierce a man's heart. You just needed to break his ribs and rupture his organs. Internal injuries were deadly and nearly impossible to treat. Polearms, the true workhorses of medieval combat, offered reach, control, and variety. The halberd, combining spear, axe, and hook, was a favorite among Swiss and German infantry. The glaive, with its long blade, was elegant but deadly. The billhook, adapted from a farming tool, was common among English soldiers. These weapons could thrust, slice, or pull down a mounted opponent. They formed deadly hedge walls against cavalry and cut down charging foes with grim efficiency. For the average foot soldier, the spear was king. Cheap, simple, and deadly. A trained formation of spearmen could hold off knights if their nerves held. Phalanxes of sharpened tips, raised and locked in place, turned charges into massacres. Cavalry that struck too soon or too shallow met walls of oak and iron. And then, of course, were the ranged weapons, revolutionizing the battlefield long before gunpowder. The longbow, especially in English hands, was a weapon of national pride and brutal impact. Made from yew wood, standing 6 feet tall, a well-made longbow had a draw weight of up to 120 pounds. It took years to master. English law required archery practice from youth. At Agincourt, Crécy, and Poitiers, the longbow was death from a distance, piercing armor, dismounting knights, silencing horses. Crossbows were even deadlier, easier to learn, heavier to load, but they could be used by nearly anyone. And once fired, they struck with force enough to drive quarrels through chainmail and bone. They were despised by the nobility, considered unchivalrous. The church at one point even tried to ban them for use against Christians, but that didn't last. War, after all, favors results. Siege weapons brought the scale of violence to cities and castles. Catapults hurled stones and fire. Trebuchets, counterweight-powered giants, could fling half-ton projectiles with uncanny precision. Some flung diseased carcasses or barrels of filth over walls to spread plague and panic. Ballistae fired massive bolts that impaled lines of men, and battering rams, shielded under wooden frames, pounded gates until they shattered. Even small weapons had terrifying utility. Daggers, roundel, ballock, misericord, were carried by nearly everyone. They were last resorts, tools for mercy kills or finishers in the mud. A dagger thrust into the eye slit of a helm ended many duels. Others were used to slit throats, cut bindings, or in the darkest moments to take one's own life. Shields, too, were weapons. A well-timed bash could stagger an opponent. Kite shields, round shields, pavizes, all carried heraldry, but served brutal purpose. They blocked arrows, deflected blades, and sometimes bore spikes or studs for offense. Helmets evolved rapidly, from conical nasal helms of the early period to full-visored bassinets and great helms of later centuries. Protection came at the cost of vision and hearing. Some knights removed visors during combat, to breathe or see, only to take arrows in the face. Armor was a constant arms race. Chainmail, or mail, offered flexibility and solid defense, but was heavy and expensive. Later, plate armor became dominant, especially for knights. Articulated plates allowed movement while protecting joints. But even plate could be beaten with focused force, and it didn't protect against heat, exhaustion, or thirst. A man in full plate, unhorsed and surrounded, was a metal tomb waiting to happen. All of this, every spike, every inch of tempered steel, had one purpose: to end life quickly, or horribly. Medieval warfare was not about clean kills. It was about incapacitation, about fear. A soldier who saw a comrade's leg hacked off or skull crushed was less likely to press forward. And it worked. The weapons weren't just tools. They were psychological weapons. A line of archers releasing a storm of arrows could break morale before swords clashed. The sound of galloping cavalry or the chant of advancing spearmen could make men drop their weapons and run. These tools, forged in fire and blood, made the battlefield a place of suffering. They were symbols of power, extensions of will, and in the hands of men driven by desperation, faith, or vengeance, they made the Middle Ages a time of relentless brutality. The battlefield may have been a place of blood and glory, but the siege, the long, slow grind of warfare, was where brutality became methodical. If open combat was a storm, a siege was a drought, a starvation of hope, inch by inch, and while a battlefield could end in hours, a siege could stretch into seasons, even years, dragging both armies and civilians into a nightmare from which only the strongest emerged alive. Sieges were more than a test of arms. They were games of endurance, cunning, and cruelty. The besieged had walls, high, thick, and often centuries old, but the attackers had time, tools, and desperation. A castle wasn't just a military stronghold. It was a town, a storehouse, a prison. And once the gates were barred and supplies cut off, it became a crucible of suffering. When an army laid siege to a fortress or town, it didn't always begin with violence. It began with strangulation. Supply routes were severed, rivers dammed or diverted, fields burned to prevent foraging, wells poisoned, forests around the city cut for timber to build siege equipment. The invaders built camps, often elaborate, with trenches, wooden palisades, and rows of tents that stretched across the horizon like a second hostile city. Inside the walls, life grew darker by the day. Food stores were guarded, rationed, sometimes stolen in the night. Bread was stretched with sawdust, old hides boiled into soup. Horses and dogs disappeared. Rats were hunted, children died first, their bodies buried quickly, or not at all. Illness spread in the tight quarters, lice, fleas, and worse. With clean water scarce, people drank what they could find. Disease did the rest. Sanitation collapsed. Waste filled alleys and ran down stairwells. Privies overflowed. Chamber pots were dumped from windows, infecting the streets below. Corpses lay unburied in churches. The smell of rotting flesh became part of the air. The dead outnumbered the living by the time help, if any came, arrived. But the defenders didn't suffer passively. They fought back from the walls, launching arrows, stones, and insults. Boiling oil and molten pitch were poured on ladder climbers. Defenders flung flaming barrels or animal carcasses infected with disease. Some set fire to siege towers, others collapsed tunnels. It was a gruesome chess match with human pieces. The besiegers weren't idle. They built siege towers, rolling wooden fortresses covered in hides to deflect fire, taller than the walls they approached. Inside were ladders, archers, and men with grappling hooks. Battering rams smashed gates, their iron heads shaped like beasts. Sappers dug under foundations, lighting fires to collapse entire sections of wall. Trebuchets hurled massive stones, firebombs, or worse, the decaying heads of fallen enemies flung over ramparts to spread fear and disease. Some sieges ended in surrender. The terms could be merciful, safe passage for defenders, sparing of civilians, but often they were not. And when resistance dragged on too long, or when the attackers finally broke through by force, what followed was catastrophic. The sack of a city was a sanctioned nightmare. For a set period, sometimes hours, often days, the victors were allowed to take what they pleased. This wasn't undisciplined looting. It was policy, a reward, a warning to others, and no one was spared. Men were cut down in the streets, whether armed or not. Women and children were dragged from homes and assaulted. Churches, once seen as sanctuaries, were ransacked, altars smashed, relics stolen or defiled, monks and priests killed, or worse. Entire libraries were burned, centuries of knowledge turned to ash for spite or warmth. Houses were looted, then torched, families slaughtered in their doorways. Anyone suspected of hiding valuables was tortured, some burned alive, others hanged from rafters. The violence wasn't always strategic, it was emotional. Pent-up rage from weeks of waiting, hunger, fear, and the knowledge that the next siege could be theirs. The psychological impact was immense. Survivors didn't speak of it. Some went mad, others wandered, refusing to rebuild. Whole towns became ghost cities, remembered only through scars on the land. Some were rebuilt, stronger walls, deeper wells, more watchful sentries. Others remained ruins, stories to frighten children. And yet, sieges kept happening. Because walls could not always stop ambition. Because castles were symbols of defiance, power, rebellion. Kings couldn't afford to ignore them. Lords couldn't afford to lose them. And for the common soldier, a siege was both curse and opportunity. The reward of a successful siege could be immense: land, wealth, titles, women. But the risk was starvation, disease, or being impaled outside the enemy gates. The stakes were always high. Some of the most infamous sieges in history came from this era. The Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, where crusaders slaughtered thousands, their boots soaked in blood. The Siege of Béziers in 1209, when Catholic forces killed 20,000 men, women, and children, many of them fellow Christians, to root out heresy. The Siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266, the longest in English history, which lasted 6 months and devastated both sides. Sieges were war distilled. Less movement, more misery; less glory, more decay. The battle didn't rage in bursts, it crept in waves. Hunger was the greatest killer. Disease was the second. And when the gates finally broke, violence poured in like a flood. This too was medieval warfare, not the open field, but the slow crush, the waiting game, the silent death of hope. Outside the city walls and beyond the battlefield, another war raged, quieter, less visible, but just as brutal. It was the war against the common people. In medieval Europe, civilians were not merely bystanders. They were obstacles, victims, resources, and sometimes even weapons. And in a world where mercy was rationed and survival bought with pain, the weakest paid the highest price. The peasant, the backbone of the medieval world, had no armor, no sword, no banner. He had a hoe, a thatched roof, a patch of land, His seasons were measured by planting and harvest, not campaigns. But when war came, his world was shattered. Armies didn't march in straight lines or along clean borders. They moved like floods, and villages were often the first to drown. Foraging was a military term that meant looting with purpose. Soldiers needed food, shelter, and firewood, and they took it. Crops were trampled underfoot, grain stolen from barns, oxen butchered, chickens tossed into cookpots. Wooden carts, fences, even parts of houses were stripped and burned to warm the night. Tools were confiscated or broken. Wells were fouled. What wasn't useful was often destroyed, simply to deny it to the enemy. And the villagers, they had little recourse. Most lacked weapons. Even if they had pitchforks or axes, they were no match for trained soldiers. Some fled into the woods, returning only when the danger passed. Others stayed, hoping submission would mean survival. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. Women bore the heaviest burden. Rape was not just an individual crime, it was a strategy, used to humiliate, dominate, and instill terror. It was often overlooked by commanders or even tacitly encouraged. The trauma was generational. Many women never spoke of it. Others took their own lives. Entire communities bore the shame, the silence, and the pain of what had been done behind closed doors or out in the open. Pregnancy didn't protect anyone. Neither did age. Girls, widows, the elderly, all were vulnerable. And when a village was sacked, it was the women who had to rebuild, care for the wounded, bury the dead. In some cases, they were conscripted into armies as cooks or washers. Others became servants, or worse, in military camps. A few learned to fight, often for revenge, but they were rare. Children lived in war's shadow. Some grew up never knowing peace. They watched fields burn. They saw parents killed. Some were taken as hostages or used as messengers. Boys were sometimes recruited as squires or errand runners. Others simply disappeared to famine, disease, or violence no one ever accounted for. There were no childhoods in war, only smaller victims. And what of the elderly? Grandparents who had once told stories by the fire found themselves abandoned, unable to flee when armies approached. Those too old to fight were also too old to matter. They were ignored at best, abused at worst. The strong trampled the weak, and in war there was no shelter in age. Churches and monasteries, once considered holy sanctuaries, became contested ground. In some regions, attackers still respected sacred spaces. In others, these buildings were looted first. Gold chalices, altar cloths, relics, all held value. Monks and priests were no safer than villagers. Some were tortured for information. Others were executed in front of their flocks. Sacred texts were burned, nuns raped, bells melted into swords. Yet some places resisted. Monks armed themselves. Abbeys became fortresses. A few stories survive of clerics defending relics with spears or blades. But these were exceptions. More often, they prayed while soldiers kicked in doors. Refugees poured across the land, a slow river of suffering. Entire villages emptied overnight. Families carried what they could, a sack of grain, a child, a rusty pan. Some had carts, others only their feet. They walked into forests, up hills, into caves. Some wandered for weeks, some died within miles of home. The strong preyed on the weak, even among refugees. Hunger turned neighbor against neighbor. Disease followed wherever the displaced went. Crowded into makeshift camps, they passed lice, typhus, dysentery. Water was filthy, food was scarce. The air stank of rot. Bandits haunted the roads. Wolves emerged from the woods, feeding on the dead. There was no law, and still, the wars went on. For those who stayed, life became survival. They bartered, hid, prayed. Some collaborated with armies to gain protection. Others resisted in secret. A poisoned well, a murdered scout, a whispered warning to allies. These acts were dangerous. Some paid dearly, their homes burned, their families killed. Even after war passed, the scars remained: burned houses, empty cradles, fields gone fallow, tools rusted and lost, trauma that lived in silence. Entire villages vanished from maps, others renamed, rebuilt, but never the same. And the people? They kept going, because they had no choice. In medieval warfare, civilians were never collateral damage. They were part of the battlefield, targets of opportunity, victims of circumstance. Their stories rarely made it into the chronicles. No ballads were sung for the farmers who lost everything. But their suffering was real. It shaped the world around them. Because war does not just destroy armies, it destroys homes, traditions, generations. And in the Middle Ages, this destruction was part of the plan. Not every medieval battle unfolded in wide-open fields or at the foot of stone fortresses. Some of the most vicious fighting happened in places far less predictable. Dense forests, treacherous river crossings, narrow mountain passes, boggy marshlands, and steep ravines. These environments shaped the very nature of war and turned geography into a weapon as deadly as any sword. Commanders who understood terrain often beat those who didn't, regardless of numbers. 1,000 knights on horseback were useless in the wrong conditions. Cavalry couldn't ride through a marsh. Siege engines couldn't roll up a mountain trail. Archers were ineffective in fog, and when an army couldn't see or move freely, its advantage vanished. Suddenly, numbers meant nothing. Let's begin with forests, ancient, sprawling, and thick with danger. Medieval Europe was covered in vast woodlands. Traveling through one was already perilous. Doing so with hundreds of soldiers, wagons, and horses turned a difficult march into a nightmare. Trees blocked light, underbrush slowed movement, sound carried strangely. An enemy hiding in the woods could ambush from almost anywhere, then disappear just as quickly. Guerrilla tactics thrived here. Small, mobile groups of fighters, often local, could devastate a marching army. They knew the bends in the road, the blind corners, the places where horses struggled. They used hit-and-run attacks, set traps, and made noise to spread confusion. Arrows came from above, spears from the shadows. Entire columns broke under surprise attacks from the trees. Some commanders avoided forests entirely. Others tried to cut paths through them, a slow and vulnerable process. Many had no choice. And when they entered the woods without scouts or maps, they often didn't leave. Then came the rivers. Europe's landscape was crisscrossed by waterways, rivers, streams, creeks. Some were shallow and calm, others swift and cold. Few had bridges. Most crossings were fords, narrow points where wagons could pass if the current wasn't too strong. Crossing a river during peacetime was slow. During war, it was deadly. An army crossing a river was exposed. Soldiers had to wade or swim. Horses balked, wagons stuck, armor pulled men under. And from the far bank, archers had the perfect angle. Entire battalions drowned midstream. Others fled before ever reaching the water. Some were driven back by cavalry charges the moment they reached the shore. Freezing water could kill as surely as arrows. Soldiers caught mid-crossing in winter had no protection. Mail rusted, limbs numbed, fires wouldn't light. The best defense? Not to cross at all. The best offense? Wait until your enemy tried. Marshes were worse. What looked like open field could be a deadly trap. Mud sucked at boots. Horses flailed and panicked. Men sank to their knees or waists. Arrows fired low, skipped across the surface, striking legs and bellies. Heavy armor made movement impossible. If someone fell, they often didn't get back up. Some commanders used marshes intentionally. They lured enemies in, then attacked from the flanks or from higher ground. The Battle of Lewes in 1264 saw troops bogged down and slaughtered. And these wetlands weren't just inconvenient, they were death traps. More than one army disappeared into a mire and never reformed. Mountain paths brought their own horrors. Winding roads, steep cliffs, narrow ledges, perfect for ambush. A tree felled at the right moment could block an entire army. Rocks dropped from above crushed soldiers and broke morale. Fog and snow turned trails into mazes. Supply wagons overturned, horses panicked. And when the first attack came, a few arrows, a thrown spear, panic could sweep through the line. Defending a mountain pass was far easier than attacking one. A handful of men could hold off hundreds if the terrain worked in their favor. Look to the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Scottish Highlands. All saw blood spilled on winding trails too narrow for retreat. And it wasn't just about the terrain. The weather added layers of unpredictability. Rain turned roads to rivers. Snow hid traps. Thunder deafened commands. Winds scattered arrows. Fires went out. Boughs snapped. Soldiers froze. A campaign could be lost, not through battle, but through a poorly timed storm. Skirmishes in these environments were especially terrifying. Visibility was low, paths twisted, noise bounced in strange ways. A man might hear screams but not know where they came from. Reinforcements were hard to find. Retreats became routes. Friendly fire was common. One wrong turn led to isolation. Wounded men lay in bushes, calling for help no one could hear. Sometimes, these environments bred new tactics. Camouflage was used. Branches woven into helms, faces painted, cloaks made from forest bark. Scouts and trackers became essential. Speed and silence replaced brute force. And commanders learned that sometimes patience was more lethal than the sword. There are accounts of ambushes so swift that the victims didn't even know they were under attack until it was over. An arrow to the neck, a rock from above, a spear through the back. One chronicle describes an entire company massacred in a gorge in less than 10 minutes. None escaped. No one saw it coming. War in these places wasn't glorious. It was hunting. Predation. Soldiers became prey, and the land itself chose sides. The men who survived such battles were changed. They didn't boast. They whispered. They spoke of shadows, of cold, of the stink of marsh mud, of friends who vanished into fog and never came back. These weren't battles of strategy, they were battles of survival. In medieval warfare, the terrain could be your greatest ally or your worst enemy. Those who respected it learned to use it. Those who didn't were buried in it. When the shouting stopped and the dust settled, when the last clash of metal faded into groans, the real horror began. Medieval battles were not finished when one side fled. They lingered, smoldered, and continued in a quieter, deadlier form, through wounds that festered, through fevers that burned unseen, through the stench of infection that clung to every stretcher, every ditch, every pile of corpses. Disease, not war, was the real executioner. The battlefield was no place of healing. It was a charnel house. Men lay tangled in mud, blood, and worse. Many were still alive, bleeding from gashes, moaning for help, but few received any. Priorities were different in those moments. Victory came first, looting second. Mercy, if there was any, came much later, if it came at all. Survivors of wounds faced a brutal truth. A second, slower war was beginning. Because medieval medicine was primitive, improvised, and often more harmful than helpful. There were no antiseptics, no germ theory, no understanding of bacteria. A clean bandage was a luxury. Boiled water was rare. A wound, even a shallow one, was a portal for death. Take a sword cut to the leg. If it didn't slice an artery, and if the man wasn't trampled or left behind, he might survive the initial blow, but what came after? Dirt, sweat, rotting cloth. Perhaps the wound was stitched with a dirty needle, perhaps not stitched at all. Then came the fever, the heat, the swelling, skin blackening, the smell, the slow realization that the wound wasn't healing, it was killing. Gangrene was common, the death of tissue due to lack of blood and infection. It crept slowly, starting with numbness, then color change, then stench. The only treatment? Amputation. If a surgeon was brave and skilled enough, and if the patient didn't bleed to death in the process. Battlefield surgery was brutal. Tools were few: bone saws, iron hooks, pincers. Anesthetics didn't exist. At best, a patient got a slug of wine or a stick to bite. Limbs were cut quickly, stumps cauterized with red-hot irons or scalding oil. Pain was excruciating. Survival was rare. Infection followed many into the grave. Wounds weren't the only danger. Arrows that stayed in the body caused rot from the inside. Those removed often took flesh and muscle with them. Dirty blades introduced bacteria directly into the bloodstream, and the battlefield was filthy. Mud mixed with feces, blood, rotting flesh, broken gear, and decomposing animals. Barber surgeons handled many treatments. Some trained, most self-taught. They pulled teeth, set bones, drained boils. They used leeches to cleanse blood, applied poultices of herbs, clay, or pig fat. Some knew what they were doing, many did not. Surgery was done in open air or crowded tents. Tools were rarely cleaned, and patients lay among flies and rats. Hospitals were few. Most were religious institutions run by monks. They offered prayers, rest, some herbal knowledge, willow bark for pain, garlic for infection, honey for wounds. But they were overrun during war. Beds were shared, sheets unwashed. Diseases spread easily. A man might enter with a leg wound and die of fever by morning. Even victory didn't protect soldiers. Camps became breeding grounds for disease. Crowded tents, poor hygiene, spoiled food, and open latrines ensured sickness spread rapidly. Dysentery was constant, soldiers soiling themselves with every step. Typhoid, tuberculosis, and various fevers took hold quickly. Men dropped without ever seeing battle. And when one man coughed, others followed. Flu-like epidemics raced through ranks. Coughing, rashes, swelling glands. Quarantine didn't exist. Sick men slept beside healthy ones, cooked meals, drew water, died suddenly. Sometimes, whole units vanished overnight. No battle needed. Rats were everywhere, feeding on bodies, supplies, and excrement. With them came fleas, and with fleas came plague. The Black Death of the 14th century didn't just devastate cities, it spread in armies. One coughing soldier could doom a regiment. Commanders tried to keep sick men isolated, but without understanding, their efforts often made things worse. Death in the aftermath wasn't heroic. It was slow, wet, undignified. Men curled up in blankets, shivering. Others screamed in delirium. Some wept for their mothers. Few had proper burials. Many were dumped in pits. Some were buried alive. Disease didn't care for bravery. Even the healthy suffered. The smell of the dead hung thick. Flies clouded the air. Food spoiled quickly. Water ran foul. PTSD, though not yet named, was everywhere. Men flinched at sudden sounds. Others withdrew completely. Some turned to drink, others to God, many to silence. War also brought disease to civilians. Soldiers moved from town to town, bringing illness with them. Villagers who offered food or shelter soon found their families coughing blood. Markets became empty, churches filled with prayers and corpses. Even after an army left, the sickness lingered. Medical knowledge advanced slowly. Some treatments helped. Boiled linen for bandages, alcohol for cleaning wounds. Certain herbs eased pain or slowed infection. Honey and garlic were surprisingly effective against bacteria, but superstition still reigned. Bleeding was common. So were spells, charms, and holy relics. Desperate men tried anything. Over time, some doctors learned. Books from the Muslim world offered better surgical techniques. Jewish and Christian healers shared knowledge. Universities emerged. But for centuries, war medicine was mostly guesswork and guts. In many ways, the most dangerous day for a medieval soldier wasn't the day of battle. It was the day after, when adrenaline faded, wounds throbbed, and fevers rose. when the shouting stopped, but the suffering continued. Surviving combat was a coin toss. Surviving the healing process? Even less certain. And yet, men returned. They fought again. Sometimes wounded, scarred, limping. They brought back stories of comrades who bled to death or went mad from infection. And they remembered that in medieval war, pain didn't end at victory. It lingered, festered, killed in silence. Victory on the battlefield in medieval times was rarely the end of violence. Sometimes it marked the beginning of something even darker, the reckoning. In a world without the Geneva Conventions, prisoner rights, or humanitarian oversight, captivity was a roulette wheel of brutality. The blade might spare you in battle, only to catch up in the aftermath. The fate of a captured man depended on many things: his rank, his wealth, his nationality, the mood of his captor, and the politics of the day. A noble knight might live in relative comfort. A peasant foot soldier might not live at all. For the aristocracy, war was as much about profit as it was about power. Ransoms were a core part of chivalric warfare. A captured noble could command a fortune. Captors wrote to families, demanded gold, land, or political favors. Negotiations could take months, even years. In the meantime, the prisoner might be housed in a castle, allowed to exercise, eat well, and even receive visitors. Some lived better in captivity than they had at home. Yet these were the lucky few. For most soldiers, especially those without a noble lineage or coin to their name, capture meant horror. Victors often saw them as burdens, mouths to feed, risks to manage. Executions en masse were common. After the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English forces under Henry V slaughtered hundreds, possibly thousands, of French prisoners. Out of fear, they would regroup or attack the baggage train. No trial, no mercy, just cold efficiency. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, though that existed too. It was logistics. Armies on the move couldn't carry prisoners. Feeding them drained supplies. Guarding them slowed progress. And so prisoners became liabilities. And liabilities were eliminated. When executions weren't immediate, forced labor was the alternative. Captives dug ditches, repaired fortifications, carried supplies, or tended to animals. In some cases, they were marched hundreds of miles to distant fortresses, mines, or galleys. The journey alone killed many. Exposure, starvation, disease, and exhaustion claimed them before their chains ever came off. Slavery was another fate. In parts of Europe, especially near the borders with Muslim empires or Norse raiders, captives were sold like livestock. Christians enslaved Muslims. Muslims enslaved Christians. Slavs were enslaved by both. Men, women, and children vanished into markets where no one asked their names. For many, this was a fate worse than death, an erasure of identity, dignity, and hope. Some prisoners were kept alive for sport, paraded through towns in chains, mocked, beaten, sometimes mutilated for entertainment. Others were used as political pawns. Princes taken young, raised in foreign courts to become loyal subjects or docile rulers. Sons held as leverage over rebellious lords. Entire towns forced to send hostages, a child, a priest, a dozen women, as insurance for peace. Torture wasn't a given, but it wasn't rare either. Inquisitions, vendettas, or strategic interrogations made it commonplace. The rack, the wheel, hot irons, thumbscrews, all existed. Sometimes it was to extract military secrets, other times to send a message. A maimed man returning home told a clearer story than any letter. And then there were the dungeons. Not the fantasy kind with flickering torches and talking rats, the real ones, dank and silent. Cells cut into stone, dripping with moisture, filled with rot. Prisoners chained to walls or left to lie in filth. Food was scarce, water brackish, vermin constant. Some prisoners spent years like this. Others died nameless in the dark, their bones never found. Some survived captivity, only to be broken in other ways, returned home penniless, physically ruined, psychologically shattered. Men who couldn't speak above a whisper, who jumped at shadows, who sat alone at feasts and wept at loud noises. Their wounds weren't visible, but they were deep. Ransoms, too, could backfire. Some families refused to pay. Others went bankrupt to save a son or brother. Negotiations broke down. Messengers were killed. Time dragged on. A man might spend years waiting for a rescue that never came. And even when paid, there was no guarantee the captor would release them. Hostages were perhaps the cruelest victims of war diplomacy. Children taken as pledges for a treaty. Wives sent to enemy courts as signs of good faith. They lived under constant threat, one betrayal from their kin, and they could be maimed, imprisoned, or executed. These weren't wartime accidents. They were policy. Captivity wasn't always iron bars. Sometimes it was a golden cage. Nobles raised in enemy lands, taught foreign customs, married into foreign families, made to love what they once hated. A slow, subtle erasure of loyalty. And when war resumed, they found themselves fighting for those who had once been their captors. In the annals of medieval war, death in battle could be swift. Captivity, by contrast, was drawn-out punishment, a slow grind of hope and humiliation. Some escaped, some bought their way out. Others were exchanged in prisoner swaps or released after peace was signed. But many simply vanished, consumed by the machinery of war. They are the silent casualties. Not the fallen on the field, but the forgotten in the dungeons. The marched, the maimed, the manipulated. In medieval warfare, surrender was not salvation. It was the beginning of a different kind of fight, one against despair, darkness, and the odds of being remembered. To the outside world, the banners flying and trumpets sounding at the end of a medieval battle marked a clear moment, victory. But for those on the ground, civilians, prisoners, even some soldiers, the moment the enemy broke was not the end of violence. It was the beginning of a new phase, a more chaotic, less regulated, and often more savage aftermath. Victory was not peace. It was license. It was an unspoken contract. You've endured the march, the hunger, the fear, the wounds. Now you are owed something. And for medieval armies, that something was everything they could lay their hands on. A city under siege might hope for leniency. Its defenders might throw open the gates at the last moment, hoping to spare the population. Sometimes it worked. More often, it didn't. Because if the siege had dragged on, if the attackers had suffered losses, if rations had run low and tempers frayed, mercy dried up. The sack was a practice as old as war itself. Once inside a city or town, the victors fanned out, street by street, house by house. Soldiers kicked down doors, looted shops, emptied chests, stripped churches, and seized food. Grain stores were plundered, animals slaughtered, and wine barrels cracked open. Anything of value, jewelry, coins, cloth, tools was taken. But looting wasn't the worst of it. Civilians bore the brunt of a victorious army's wrath. Women were raped in alleys, in churches, even in front of their families. Children were beaten, kidnapped, or killed. Men suspected of resistance, even if they were just town watchmen or armed merchants, were dragged into the street and executed, sometimes beheaded, sometimes worse. Fires were common. Entire neighborhoods went up in flames. Commanders claimed they had limited control. Some issued orders to stop the violence. Others pretended to. A few encouraged it, believing it would instill fear in future enemies. In truth, once discipline broke down, it was nearly impossible to regain. 100 soldiers with swords and torches could reduce a city to ashes in a night. The plunder of Constantinople in 1004 by Crusader forces was one of the most infamous examples. Christian soldiers, supposedly on a holy mission, looted and desecrated the most sacred city in Eastern Christendom. Churches were stripped, relics stolen, Icons smashed, nuns were raped, nobles humiliated, gold mosaics pried from walls, books, some irreplaceable, fed into bonfires. The city had not resisted. It had fallen victim to greed, disguised as faith. Similar stories played out across Europe. The sack of Béziers in 1209, during the Albigensian Crusade, was particularly brutal. The city's defenders were overwhelmed, and the entire population, men, women, and children, were massacred. The papal legate reportedly said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether apocryphal or not, the phrase became symbolic of the era's merciless victories. In the Hundred Years' War, sacked towns in France and England endured repeated devastation. Armies returned every few years, pillaging again. Farmhouses never had time to recover. Churches were robbed repeatedly. The same families buried relatives in the same scorched earth. Looting also led to infighting. Soldiers killed each other over silver spoons. Units turned on each other in drunken rages. Officers fought duels over fine horses or captured prisoners. The spoils of war became a cause of war among victors. And the destruction wasn't limited to the first days. In the weeks following a sack, the occupying army set up a rough form of control, often with cruelty. Taxes were imposed, curfews enforced, public executions displayed to crush dissent. Any signs of resistance were met with harsh retaliation. Bodies were left hanging at crossroads or nailed to gates, messages carved in pain. Sometimes, victors used psychological warfare. They forced locals to watch as churches burned, or compelled children to dig graves for their parents. Others humiliated local leaders, shaving heads, stripping them naked, or parading them through the streets in chains. These weren't random acts. They were demonstrations of power, designed to break spirits. And yet, within this darkness, there were moments of humanity. Some commanders did protect civilians. Some monks offered shelter. Some soldiers refused to take part in the carnage. There were oaths of protection sworn, safe zones respected, and prisoners ransomed rather than butchered. These were rare, but they remind us that cruelty, though common, was not universal. Still, for most people on the receiving end of victory, the memory was one of trauma. Children who survived these sackings grew up fearing foreign flags. Women remembered the sound of boots in the street long after the torches went out. Men who had surrendered peacefully cursed the mercy they'd shown, and in many cases, the physical scars remained. Broken walls, burned homes, desecrated tombs. Economically, the damage was profound. Fields went untended, markets closed, trade collapsed, survivors fled, or were too traumatized to return. Entire towns became ghost towns. Some never recovered. Others took generations to rebuild. Politically, too, the aftermath of a brutal victory sowed hatred. Revenge cycles began. Families joined rebellions. Children of the conquered grew up to become enemies. Wars that might have ended with surrender continued underground, fed by the brutality of peace. And for the soldiers, many were changed. Some grew numb. Others sought forgiveness. A few chronicled their actions with pride. Others never spoke of what they had done. Victory was not the end of war. It was the beginning of a different kind. One waged against memory, identity, and the soul of a people. In medieval warfare, peace didn't follow conquest. It had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, bone by bone, from the ruins left behind. Among the most grueling experiences in medieval warfare, none were more psychologically and physically punishing than sieges. A siege wasn't a clash of armies. It was a test of endurance, of patience, of starvation, suffering, and slow collapse. When a castle or walled city was surrounded, everything changed. Time became the enemy, and survival became the only objective. At first glance, castles seemed invincible. Towering stone walls, deep moats, high battlements, bristling with archers. But every castle had one fatal flaw. It could run out of food. That weakness made siege warfare one of the most common and cruel forms of medieval conflict. The basic tactic was simple: surround the fortress, cut off supplies, and wait. No food in, no people out. This technique, called investment, turned castles into prisons. Defenders found themselves caged in their own stronghold, watching from the walls as enemy campfires lit the surrounding fields. Inside, supplies were rationed. Bread grew stale. Salt meat ran low. Water was hoarded. Horses, once proud war animals, were slaughtered. Dogs and cats followed. Eventually, people were next. Cannibalism, though rare, is recorded. At the siege of Marrara during the First Crusade, starving crusaders reportedly ate the dead, and they weren't alone. Disease took hold quickly. Medieval sanitation was poor even in normal times. In a siege, it was disastrous. Sewers overflowed. Clean water ran out. Waste piled up. Illness spread. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, all flourished. With people packed tightly together, infection moved fast. The weak died. The strong weakened. Morale collapsed. Every day without relief chipped away at courage. Soldiers questioned their leaders. Civilians begged to surrender. Religious leaders alternated between hopeful prayer and grim prophecy. Fights broke out over food. Suicides rose. Some tried to escape. Few succeeded. Anyone caught was usually executed to discourage others. Outside, the besieging army fared little better. Camping for weeks or months took its toll. Weather wore them down. Rain, heat, snow. Supplies had to be transported from far away. Morale dropped here too. Discipline cracked. Desertion became a real threat. Some commanders even hired local farmers to supplement their rations, paying them with loot from earlier conquests. To break the stalemate, engineers got to work. Siege engines were the terrifying technology of the day. Trebuchets, mangonels, ballistas. These hurled massive stones, firepots, or even diseased corpses over the walls. Psychological warfare was part of the arsenal. The stench of a rotting cow could spread panic. A burning projectile could start a citywide blaze. Siege towers, enormous, mobile wooden structures, were rolled up to the walls, covered in wet hides to resist fire. Inside, archers and swordsmen waited for the moment to cross over. Below, sappers dug tunnels beneath the walls. If successful, they'd burn the supports, causing collapses. Sometimes the tunnels caved in early, killing the sappers. Defenders were not idle. They poured boiling water, tar, oil, anything that could maim or delay. They dropped heavy stones, fired arrows, launched counterattacks. Some built countertunnels. Others attempted to lure the enemy into traps with fake breaches or poisoned food supplies left unattended. But walls couldn't hold forever. Once a section fell, the assault began. Soldiers surged in through the breach. House-to-house fighting followed, brutal, personal, and chaotic. Defenders used burning pitch, knives, stones, whatever they had. Civilians were caught in the crossfire or deliberately killed to eliminate resistance. If the city or castle fell, the next stage was usually worse: the sack. Looting, rape, slaughter. It was the price paid for resistance. A quick surrender might spare the people. Might. A prolonged defense? Almost certainly not. No quarter was a common order after long sieges. Survivors were few. Historical examples are chilling. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade ended with widespread massacre. Blood reportedly ran knee-deep in some places. An exaggeration, perhaps, but one born from something real. The siege of Acre, the fall of Antioch, the storming of Béziers, all show the cost of being on the losing end. Some sieges lasted years. The siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 lasted 6 months, the longest in English medieval history. The defenders held out under constant attack, despite starvation. They finally surrendered under negotiated terms, a rare mercy. For the victors, sieges were expensive gambles. The longer it dragged on, the more it drained manpower and gold. If the defenders received reinforcements, the entire campaign could collapse. Some attackers pretended to withdraw, only to return days later in ambush. Others offered fake truces to lull defenders into false hope. Truces and negotiations played a central role. Messages passed over walls, demands made, hostages sent. Sometimes terms were reached, a negotiated surrender in exchange for safe passage. But broken promises were common. And once trust was lost, few ever surrendered again. The psychological scars of sieges lingered for generations. Survivors told stories of starvation and fear. Children grew up haunted by the screams of neighbors. Entire towns were depopulated. Rebuilding took decades. Some places were never inhabited again. And yet, the siege remained a cornerstone of medieval strategy. Castles made it necessary. Geography made it inescapable. And human stubbornness, the refusal to yield, made it brutal. In medieval war, the slow death of a siege could be worse than the swift terror of the battlefield. It was a war not of minutes, but of months. Not of courage, but of endurance. And for many, it was the cruelest chapter of all. In modern imagination, the word chivalry conjures images of noble knights astride majestic horses, saving maidens, protecting the weak, and engaging in honorable duels beneath fluttering banners. But the battlefield of the medieval world tells a very different story. Beneath the romantic poetry and polished armor lay a much grimmer reality. One where the chivalric code was as often broken as it was upheld, and where brutality hid behind the glint of polished steel. The chivalric code was not a universal law. It was more of a social ideal, loosely enforced and selectively applied. At its core, it was a blend of Christian piety, aristocratic privilege, and military ethics. Knights were expected to be brave in battle, loyal to their lord, courteous to ladies, and merciful to the defeated. It was as much about appearances and rank as it was about conduct. However, the code mostly protected nobles, and often only those of the same nation or alliance. A knight might spare a captured noble foe to ransom him later, but the same knight could show no mercy to a lowly foot soldier or archer. Peasants, mercenaries, and civilians fell outside the shield of chivalry. To them, a knight could be worse than any raider. Combat rarely gave time for ideals. The medieval battlefield was not a series of duels or grand contests of honor. It was a melee of confusion, exhaustion, and panic. Knights used every advantage they could get, striking a downed foe, killing a man from behind, ambushing a sleeping enemy. These were not considered dishonorable. They were effective. Survival came first. Honor was a luxury, and cruelty was often deliberate. Maiming enemies, disfiguring prisoners, or executing captives wasn't unheard of. It was tactical. A knight might cut off the bow fingers of captured archers to render them useless, or gouge out eyes to mark a man permanently as a prisoner, or kill a defeated man to prevent the burden of guarding him. Sieges brought out the worst. During prolonged sieges, knights ordered bombardments not just on walls, but on civilians. They flung the bodies of the diseased over battlements. They demanded towns surrender or face total destruction, and sometimes, even after surrender, they executed leaders to make an example. The Crusades, often seen as the pinnacle of Christian chivalry, provide some of the darkest contrasts. Knights who had taken vows of purity and mercy stormed cities and slaughtered indiscriminately. The 1099 siege of Jerusalem saw crusaders wade through streets soaked in blood. Muslim, Jewish, and even some Christian civilians were killed. Knights desecrated mosques, burned books, looted sacred relics, all while flying banners emblazoned with the cross. In internal conflicts, chivalry was no safer. During the War of the Roses, English nobles butchered each other in battles driven by ambition, not honor. Executions of rival lords and the slaughter of surrendering troops became standard. In France, the 100 Years' War was a theater of shifting alliances, broken oaths, and mass betrayals. Knights switched sides, violated truces, and burned entire villages for coin. What about duels? Yes, they happened, but mostly between equals. And even then, treachery was not unknown. A knight might poison his rival, or bribe the seconds. Sometimes a duel was demanded for show, with the outcome already decided behind closed doors. Other times, knights manipulated honor to avoid battle entirely, using their status to negotiate safe passage while leaving common soldiers to die. And yet, the myth of chivalry endured. Why? Because the stories served a purpose. Tales of noble deeds, of knights rescuing damsels and sparing foes, gave kings a moral framework. They justified war as a righteous cause. They inspired loyalty and unity among the elite. They made the brutal seem beautiful. Courts of chivalry did exist. They debated the behavior of knights, but enforcement was rare, and punishments light. A knight might be shamed, not exiled, might lose favor, not life. Power shielded many from consequence. And when kings needed brutal men to win wars, they rarely asked how those victories were won. Literature played a huge role in masking the brutality. The Song of Roland, La Morte Arthur, the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, they painted knights as paragons of virtue, not real men with flaws, fears, and bloodied swords. Troubadours sang of gallantry. Poets turned battles into ballads. Reality was too grim for verse. Yet not all knights were monsters. Some did embody the chivalric ideal. There were moments of real mercy. Prisoners spared, towns protected, peasants defended from raiders. Orders like the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights mixed warfare with charitable missions, hospitals, food distribution, sanctuary. But even these orders committed atrocities when it suited them. The contradiction was baked into the system. A knight might hear mass in the morning, ride into battle by noon, and preside over a massacre by evening. He would confess, be absolved, and fight again the next week. Faith and violence were not opposites. They were intertwined. Women were not spared the contradiction either. Chivalry preached protection of women, yet rape in wartime was common. Knights abducted heiresses for ransom or forced marriage. Courtly love ideals romanticized pursuit and conquest, but in real life, power often meant possession. What chivalry really did was create a two-tier system. Rules for the privileged and none for the rest. A knight had a code, but it rarely protected the peasant with no name, the foreign merchant, the enemy child. For them, a knight's arrival often brought fear, not hope. The truth of chivalry is this: it was an aspiration, not a reality. A mirror polished in castles and courts, but cracked and bloodied on the battlefield. The stories remain because we want to believe in them. But in the mud and screams of medieval war, the code was tested, and far more often than not, it failed. When we think of a medieval warrior, we picture the glint of steel armor, the hiss of arrows, and the clash of swords. But these weren't just visual symbols of war. They were the products of constant innovation, desperate survival, and brutal necessity. Every piece of equipment a soldier carried, wore, or swung had a purpose born from blood. Let's begin with armor. Early in the Middle Ages, chainmail, also known as mail, was king. Composed of thousands of interlocking metal rings, it offered decent protection against slashing weapons. It could absorb a sword's edge, distribute impact, and prevent cuts. But it was labor-intensive to make and costly. A single hauberk, a mail shirt, might take a craftsman months to complete. Chainmail had weaknesses. It did little against the blunt trauma of maces or warhammers. A powerful blow could crush ribs beneath the armor. Even if the rings held, to mitigate this, warriors wore padded garments underneath. The gambeson, made of quilted linen, stuffed with wool, straw, or horsehair, it cushioned the body from impact. In fact, the gambeson was so effective that poorer soldiers often wore it alone in place of metal armor. Helmets began as simple conical designs, nasal helms with a metal strip to protect the nose. Over time, they evolved. By the 13th century, the great helm emerged, a massive cylindrical helmet that covered the entire head. It offered formidable protection, but limited vision and airflow. Knights complained of suffocating in hot weather or becoming disoriented during prolonged fights. By the 14th and 15th centuries, plate armor reached its zenith. Artisans, especially in Italy and Germany, created full suits of articulated steel plate that could deflect sword strikes, absorb arrows, and even stop crossbow bolts. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, these suits were not stiff. A properly made set allowed full range of movement. Knights could run, jump, and even perform somersaults in them, though they rarely needed to. Still, plate armor had trade-offs. It was heavy, typically between 45 to 60 pounds, and exhausting to wear for hours. It was also expensive. Only the wealthiest knights and nobles could afford a full set. Most soldiers mixed gear, a helmet, a breastplate, mail sleeves, and leather boots. Some carried shields, many had none. Weapons followed a parallel evolution. Swords were the symbol of knighthood, but their designs varied based on era and purpose. The early medieval spatha was long and straight, ideal for slashing from horseback. As armor improved, swords adapted. Tapered points allowed better thrusting into joints and gaps. Crossguards became longer for parrying. Two-handed longswords gained popularity in the late Middle Ages. They allowed powerful overhead strikes and were used in both armored duels and open battle. The bastard sword, sometimes called a hand-and-a-half sword, offered versatility, one hand for horseback, two hands for ground combat. Yet swords weren't the only killers. Axes were devastating and easier to produce. A sharp axe could hook behind a shield or cleave through a helmet. Maces and flails crushed bones. They bypassed armor by transferring blunt force through the metal. A knight hit in the chest with a mace might have his breastplate dented inward, breaking ribs and suffocating him. Polearms became the backbone of infantry warfare. Weapons like halberds, glaives, and poleaxe combined cutting, thrusting, and hooking functions. A halberd could slice like an axe, stab like a spear, and pull a rider from his horse. The Swiss and Flemish used pike formations to repel cavalry. Long spears bristling outward created walls of death. No knight, however brave, could ride into them and expect to survive. Even more terrifying were the weapons of ranged combat. The longbow, especially as used by the English, changed warfare forever. At the Battle of Agincourt, English archers rained down arrows that pierced mail and struck through visors. The secret was power. A longbow could generate more than 100 pounds of draw weight. A well-trained archer could loose 10-12 arrows per minute, creating a deadly barrage. Crossbows offered even more punch. Though slower to reload, they required less training and could punch through most armor at close range. Some bolts, known as quarrels, were thick enough to shatter bones on impact. This terrified the knightly class. In fact, the church attempted to ban crossbows at one point, calling them too inhumane. The ban was largely ignored. Shields played a vital role, especially for infantry. The kite shield, popular with Normans, provided full body coverage from shoulder to ankle. Later, the heater shield emerged, smaller, lighter, and shaped like the spade of a playing card. Cavalry preferred the latter for its mobility. Infantry often carried larger, heavier shields into tight ranks. Each weapon had counters. Armor adapted to resist blades. Blades adapted to slip through armor. Polearms countered cavalry. Cavalry used mobility to flank spears. Archers needed protection. Shield walls formed in response. It was a constant arms race, not of mass destruction, but of brutal ingenuity. Beyond the weaponry, the psychological effect of these tools mattered too. The sight of a knight in gleaming armor, wielding a two-handed sword taller than a man, could unnerve inexperienced foes. The sound of a dozen flails striking shields, the rhythm of pikes thudding into soil, the metallic squeal of plate grinding on plate. These were instruments of fear as much as of war, and let's not forget the battlefield itself. Mud was a weapon. So was the sun, the wind, the terrain. A knight weighed down in armor could drown in a marsh or fall beneath the crush of a retreat. Weapons and armor could protect, but they could not save a man from fatigue, fear, or bad luck. After battle, the brutal tools lay scattered: broken shields, bloodied axes, snapped arrows. Survivors searched the dead for better gear. Looting was common. Helmets were taken from corpses, armor stripped, swords passed from hand to hand, trophies and tools for the next fight. Each weapon, each piece of armor, each scar on the battlefield told a story of survival, of invention, and of the relentless push to find an edge. War in the Middle Ages was not static. It was constantly evolving, each new design built on the wreckage of the last. Brutality in medieval combat wasn't just in the way battles were fought. It was baked into the very tools of war. Medieval warfare might be remembered for its dramatic battles and heroic charges, but behind every moment of glory stood an unrelenting struggle just to keep armies alive. This was the hidden war, the world of logistics, supply lines, and infrastructure, and it determined whether any soldier even made it to the battlefield at all. To raise an army was difficult enough. Lords had to summon their vassals, who in turn summoned their own men. These weren't standing armies. They were temporary, feudal levies. Loyalty had to be reaffirmed, promises made, wages negotiated. Some men brought their own equipment. Others had to be outfitted. Time ticked away before the army even began to move. Once assembled, the real challenge began. An army of 10,000 men, not uncommon for a large campaign, required unimaginable quantities of food, water, fuel, and fodder. Each man needed at least 2 pounds of food per day, more if marching long distances. Horses needed hay or grain, fires needed wood, and all of it had to be found, purchased, stolen, or carried. Medieval roads were inconsistent at best, muddy paths in good weather, impassable trenches in bad. There were few bridges strong enough for carts. Rivers could delay travel for days. Mountains posed deadly risks. Entire campaigns were lost to geography, not enemy blades. Food was the greatest concern. Armies could carry only a few days' supply at most. The rest had to be gathered on the move. Some monarchs attempted to stockpile grain in advance, creating depots along the expected route, but spoilage, theft, and miscalculation often ruined these plans. More often, armies simply took what they needed. This meant foraging or requisitioning, polite terms for organized theft. Villages were stripped bare, orchards emptied, livestock slaughtered, mills destroyed, farmers left destitute. For the common people, a passing army, even a friendly one, was often indistinguishable from a rotting horde. Thirst was even harder to manage. Wells were overused or fouled. Streams ran dry. Rainwater was caught in barrels, but that required time and foresight. Rivers carried disease. Waterborne illness, dysentery, typhoid, cholera could wipe out more soldiers than swords. Marching for hours in heat without water killed thousands. And then there were the camps. An army didn't just march, it stopped. And when it stopped, it lived. Tents had to be pitched, kitchens set up, latrines dug. For every 100 soldiers, dozens of support workers toiled: cooks, grooms, armorers, clerks, tailors, farriers. Many of these people were not formally part of the army. Some were local recruits. Others were civilians following the army for work or safety. Women and children often accompanied medieval armies. Wives, servants, merchants, and camp followers performed critical roles. They washed clothes, prepared meals, mended garments, and nursed the wounded. Some even fought, especially if the camp was attacked. Others became victims of weather, disease, or soldiers. Sanitation was rudimentary. Waste disposal was minimal. Flies bred in latrines. Food spoiled. Vermin infested supplies. Diseases spread rapidly. An outbreak of camp fever, typhus, could ravage an army in days. In some cases, entire campaigns had to be aborted due to sickness. And still, the army marched. Boots wore out, horses limped, weapons dulled, arrows were lost or broken. Blacksmiths and carpenters worked constantly. Armor had to be repaired, wheels replaced. Even making rope was a critical, constant need. Campaigns might pause for days just to reforge nails or restock arrows. Communication added another layer of complexity. Messages had to be carried by riders across dangerous terrain. A missed courier could mean disaster. Orders were misunderstood or delayed. Armies moved in pieces, sometimes days apart, making coordination difficult. The fog of war often began long before the battle. And if a siege was planned, the complexity multiplied. Siege engines had to be built on site or transported overland, a near impossible task. Stone ammunition had to be sourced. Tunnels required engineers and miners. Fires demanded pitch, oil, and combustible materials. Maintaining a siege line could take months of backbreaking labor. Money underpinned everything. Soldiers had to be paid. At least in theory, coin was scarce. Debts accumulated. Mercenaries might mutiny if wages were late. Supplies had to be bought, even if only from terrified locals. Kings borrowed heavily. Wars were financed with pledges, ransoms, church taxes, and loans. A bankrupt crown meant a starving army. Winter was a campaign killer. Roads turned to sludge. Frostbite ravaged fingers. Firewood ran out. Horses perished. Foraging became impossible. Most armies halted entirely between October and April. When they didn't, the results were disastrous. Frostbitten toes, starved mules, frozen corpses. And when the army finally reached the battlefield, exhaustion was already setting in. Men who had marched for weeks on meager rations, slept under leaking tents, and suffered from lice and diarrhea. These were the warriors now expected to fight to the death. Morale was brittle, desertion common, cowardice contagious. Logistics wasn't glamorous, but it was war. It was the wheels, the ropes, the pots, the planks, the hidden world behind every shining helm and gleaming sword, the engine that turned bloodshed into campaign. In the end, medieval battles were often won, not by the knight with the sharpest blade, but by the commander with the steadiest supply line. Medieval war wasn't just the sum of swords, arrows, and armored men screaming into battle. Behind each clash was a brain, or sometimes many, shaping the outcome before a single blow was struck. The battlefield was both a physical and mental space, and the commanders who moved their pieces wisely had a better chance at turning chaos into victory. But unlike the structured doctrines of modern warfare, medieval strategy was often improvised, emotional, reactive, and brutally unforgiving. Medieval commanders lacked standardized training. There were no military academies or field manuals. Strategy came from experience, legend, or imitation. Kings learned from battles their fathers had fought. Nobles watched, listened, and survived long enough to command men of their own. Some were gifted tacticians, others were blunderers whose decisions sent thousands to die. What passed for military theory came from ancient texts, often misunderstood, or from religious belief. The Bible was consulted as often as a map. A favorable omen, a vision, or the presence of a holy relic could shape a campaign. If a general believed God was on his side, logic often went out the window. Despite this, there were patterns. Geography mattered immensely. Hills, rivers, forests, and roads weren't just background, they were weapons or traps. A wise commander used them to create choke points, ambushes, or defensible positions. Fighting uphill could doom even a larger force. Muddy terrain neutralized cavalry. Narrow passes turned open field advantages into liabilities. Castles and towns shaped strategy too. A single stronghold could block an army for months. Commanders had to decide: bypass it and risk attack from behind, or besiege it and drain time and men. Sometimes, The mere sight of a fortress changed the path of a campaign. Roads were few, and taking a wrong one could mean famine or exposure. Commanders considered the weather, or tried to. Spring campaigns were popular due to better roads and available food. Winter could kill faster than swords. Rain slowed marches, ruined powder in later centuries, and turned fields into death traps for horses and men. When battle came, it often wasn't planned. Clashes erupted unexpectedly, two forces encountering each other while scouting or raiding. But when a battle was deliberate, positioning was crucial. Commanders sought the high ground, with the sun behind them and the wind blowing away from their lines. These small choices could tip the scale. Armies were typically arranged in 3 divisions, a center and 2 flanks. Knights were held in reserve for a decisive charge. Archers lined the front or wings. Infantry formed tight ranks with spears or polearms. Cavalry was used to flank, pursue, or break a weakened line. But few plans survived contact. Communication was primitive. Horns, drums, messengers, all were easily lost in the noise and chaos. Dust clouds could obscure the battlefield. Signal flags were misread. Orders arrived late or were misunderstood. Commanders often had no real control once the battle began, so they relied on instinct. When to send in the cavalry, when to retreat, when to commit reserves. A delay of minutes could change everything. If a flank gave way, panic spread. If morale cracked, even elite troops might flee. And once an army started to run, it was nearly impossible to stop them. Pursuit turned battle into massacre. Victorious troops, fueled by adrenaline and rage, chased the fleeing enemy. Most medieval deaths occurred in this phase, not during the fight but after. Cavalry ran men down. Infantry stabbed from behind. Archers fired at backs. Discipline dissolved into slaughter. Commanders weren't immune to fear. Many led from the rear, watching from hills. Some, especially kings, entered battle in person, but were surrounded by elite guards. If a general fell, chaos often followed. The loss of leadership could unhinge a force. At Hastings in 1066, the death of Harold was the turning point. At Bouvines in 1214, King Philip II's presence inspired his men to victory. And not all victories were won through strength. Deception played a key role. Some commanders faked retreats, luring the enemy into disorder before turning to attack. Others used night marches to surprise foes. Still others bribed local guides to lead enemy armies astray. Treachery was a tool of war. Entire battles were lost because a gate was opened from within, a captain changed sides, or a detachment failed to arrive accidentally. Politics seeped into tactics. Lords who had grudges held back. Rivalries between commanders split forces. Some battles were lost before they began, not by lack of skill, but by lack of unity. Intelligence was fragile. Scouts gathered what they could, spies reported rumors, but armies moved slowly, and information quickly became outdated. A force believed to be 50 miles away could appear over the next ridge. Surprise, when it happened, was devastating. Despite these limitations, some commanders achieved brilliance. Edward III of England was a master of positioning. At Crecy in 1346, he arranged his forces on a sloping field, with longbowmen covering the flanks. The French charged uphill into mud and arrow storms. The result was slaughter. Joan of Arc, despite her youth and lack of training, inspired French troops to victories by sheer willpower and symbolic power. Her presence turned the tide in battles at Orléans and Patay. William Marshall, knighted in the 12th century, won dozens of tournaments and survived brutal civil wars. He advised kings and fought in multiple major engagements. His instincts, not his books, made him deadly. But just as often, bad leadership doomed thousands. At the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, French knights charged recklessly into Flemish militia, armed with long pikes. The result: Over 1,000 knights dead, many drowning in the nearby river. Arrogance, poor scouting, and overconfidence shattered what should have been an easy win. Commanders had to consider morale constantly. Starving men didn't fight well. If pay was late, loyalty frayed. If religious rites weren't observed, soldiers feared divine punishment. Before battle, priests blessed the army, heard confessions, and promised absolution. Many believed dying unshriven meant eternal damnation. Flags mattered more than maps. Banners identified units and leaders. If a banner fell, the unit's morale often collapsed. Capturing an enemy's banner was a psychological blow and a tactical advantage. Sieges had their own tactical considerations. Starving a city could take months. Direct assault was costly, trebuchets were slow, engineers dug tunnels to undermine walls. Defenders countered with water barrels and counter-tunnels. It was as much chess as brute force. Some commanders used terror as a strategy. Burning fields, killing prisoners, executing nobles, all served to demoralize enemies. It was cruel, but effective. Civilians often bore the worst of it. Their deaths were a message. At the same time, diplomacy shadowed every battle. A commander might send envoys before or during battle, demands for surrender, offers of safe passage, threats, bluffs. Sometimes negotiations bought time. Sometimes they lured the enemy into complacency. Seldom were they about mercy. Leadership in medieval war was a lonely job. Victory brought glory, but also danger. Rival nobles plotted. Kings turned on their most successful captains. And the line between hero and villain was thin. A brilliant campaigner could be branded a butcher, a failed one, a traitor. In the end, every battlefield was shaped by the minds behind the swords. Brilliant, flawed, ruthless, desperate minds, and their choices, in an era where minutes meant life or death, painted the field red. When we think of medieval battles, we often picture the clash of swords, the charge of cavalry, the roar of men in armor. But the true horror often came after the shouting stopped. It settled into the soil, lingered in the silence of burned villages, and etched itself into the lives of survivors. The aftermath of battle was a different kind of brutality, slower, quieter, but no less devastating. One of the most immediate and overlooked consequences was depopulation. Battles consumed more than just soldiers. They disrupted entire regions, leaving families shattered, labor pools empty, and homes abandoned. Peasants conscripted or coerced into levies never returned. Entire generations of young men were lost to a single campaign. Fields were left unplanted, or worse, planted, but unharvested, due to sudden enemy movement or raiding bands. Armies, regardless of loyalty, were a plague upon the countryside. Feeding thousands of men required more than supply chains. It demanded plunder. Foraging quickly turned into pillaging. Villages were stripped bare, livestock taken, barns emptied. In winter campaigns, the desperate cold turned troops into ravagers. Firewood was taken from homes, roofs torn apart, whole hamlets erased for fuel. Those who survived the passing of armies didn't escape. Famine followed campaigns like a shadow. Even in years of peace, most medieval communities teetered on the edge of hunger. A single failed harvest could lead to mass starvation. Add the loss of draft animals, the burning of grain stores, or the murder of village elders who coordinated planting, and the balance tipped into catastrophe. The wounded returned home, if they returned at all, as broken remnants of men. There were no hospitals, no rehabilitation centers. If a man lost a leg or arm in battle, he was often left to beg or burden his already starving family. Amputations were performed crudely, infection was rampant, scars were badges, but they didn't feed mouths or till soil. Psychological trauma, what we now call PTSD, was common but utterly misunderstood. A man who trembled at sudden noises, wept uncontrollably, or flew into rages was not treated. He was feared, shunned, labeled cursed or cowardly, the horror of battle replayed in dreams, in sudden silences, or in drunken outbursts. And no one had words for it. Economic shockwaves lasted generations. Castles had to be rebuilt, expensive endeavors that demanded higher taxes. Bridges destroyed in tactical retreats delayed trade for years. Merchants rerouted caravans, isolating towns. War broke not only bones, but economies. The wealth of one noble's victory was often taken from the backs of the common people, who bore the cost through labor, taxes, and conscription. Churches and monasteries played double roles in the aftermath. On one hand, they offered sanctuary, monks tended wounds, prayed for the dead, copied battle chronicles. Some abbeys became places of healing, but they were also targets. Wealth stored in gold goblets, chalices, and relics made churches irresistible to desperate soldiers. Many monks learned to hide their treasures and prepare escape routes. Spiritual damage was immense. Survivors questioned God's justice. Why had the pious died, while the wicked looted and lived? Sermons tried to offer answers. Sin, punishment, divine tests. But for many, faith was shaken. Pilgrimages increased as people sought meaning. Others turned to superstition, relic cults, or even heresies. Battle didn't just break bodies. It fractured belief. Borders shifted too. After a major battle, a region might be handed over to a different lord or crown. For villagers, this meant new taxes, new laws, new overlords, and the loss of inherited customs. Land ownership became fluid. Peasants who had farmed the same plots for generations found themselves exiled or forced to swear loyalty to strangers. The judicial aftermath was often grim. Justice was meted out by victors. Captured soldiers might be hanged, beheaded, or blinded as warnings. Nobles were ransomed if valuable, but humiliated if not. Peasant fighters were executed en masse. Some towns that had resisted siege were punished brutally, even after surrender. Entire populations were displaced or enslaved. The dead lay rotting. Unless a battle was near a major town, there were few efforts to bury corpses. Mass graves were dug with shovels stolen from farms. Wolves and crows feasted. Rivers ran foul. Fields sown with bones turned into ghost stories. Farmers plowing years later turned up rusted weapons or teeth. Disease often followed. Open wounds, exposure, and poor sanitation created outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and typhus. Entire communities were depopulated not by battle, but by the sickness that came in its wake. And because healers were among the dead, knowledge was lost. Midwives, herbalists, and leeches could only do so much. Art and culture suffered. Musicians died in conscription. Artists fled cities. Libraries burned. Sculptures were melted down for weapons. The trauma seeped into what little was created. Songs turned mournful. Tapestries depicted war not in triumph but in terror. Chroniclers recorded not just victories, but atrocities, entire villages wiped out, forests cut to stumps, temples desecrated. Generational memory kept the wounds open. Grandfathers told stories of the day the sky turned black with arrows. Mothers wept over brothers who never came home. Children played in ruins, climbing over the foundations of what had been homes, schools, granaries. Memory became myth. Ghosts of battles haunted the land. Some villages never recovered. They disappeared from maps, spoken of only in cautionary tales. Others were rebuilt, but differently, fortified, walled. Watchtowers rose. Community life shifted around defense. Trust between neighbors frayed. Strangers became threats. Hospitality withered. Even nature changed. Battlefields cleared trees. Rivers diverted. Animals fled. Boars returned to ruined towns. Fields went fallow and turned into forests again. Wolves bred in places once echoing with church bells. The land remembered, with scars of its own. Legal systems were reshaped by war. New charters emerged. Laws shifted to include war-related clauses, taxes for military service, New inheritance rules for widows, land grants to veterans. The feudal web tightened. Kings who won wars centralized power, curbing local lords. Monarchies grew stronger, but also more distant. The people gained peace at the cost of autonomy. Victory was not always sweet. Victorious kingdoms often found themselves overextended. New territories required garrisons, governors, and supplies. Resistance simmered. Guerrilla warfare and banditry surged. Conquerors became occupiers, and the cost of holding new land drained treasuries. For the average person, the war's end did not mean peace. It meant rebuilding. It meant burying the dead, rebuilding fences, replanting fields. It meant waiting for sons who never returned. It meant scars on bodies, minds, land, and faith. Because medieval battles weren't events, they were storms, and their wreckage lasted for decades. Even centuries after the battles ended, the legends of medieval warfare endured, in ballads, in chronicles, in stained glass and stone. But behind the tales of valor and glory lay another battlefield, memory itself. The stories told about war shaped how it was remembered, who became a hero or a villain, and what future generations believed about honor, sacrifice, and violence. Medieval chroniclers were not historians in the modern sense. They wrote under the gaze of kings, popes, abbots, or military patrons. Their quills often served political agendas. Victories were magnified, defeats reframed as divine trials. The horrors of a siege, the starvation, the cannibalism, the weeping children were downplayed or omitted. If your lord paid for the scroll, his enemies bled more than his own men ever did. The brutality of war was whitewashed, even as it was immortalized. Pain was poeticized, loss turned into divine justice. Massacres were reframed as necessary purges. The line between memory and myth blurred, and with it, the true nature of war was softened. Visual storytelling did the same. In churches and castles, stained glass windows and frescoes told of battles in brilliant colors. Knights gleamed in armor. Martyrs bled with dignity. No mud, no flies, no screams. The battlefield was turned into a moral tale of good against evil, of holy cause versus heretical rebellion. Artisans embroidered tapestries of famous victories, the Battle of Hastings, the Siege of Jerusalem, but never the aftermath. No raped peasants, no burning farms, no rivers swollen with corpses. These images, intended to inspire pride, created a sanitized memory of slaughter. Even weaponry was mythologized. Swords were named: Excalibur, Joyeuse, Durinenal. Their owners became legends. Armor was passed down like relics. A knight's helmet could become a family heirloom, tied to a story of divine protection or miraculous survival. Bards and minstrels carried the myths further. In smoky taverns and noble halls, they sang of chivalry, brotherhood, and the noble death. A knight dying in agony on a battlefield was transformed into a selfless hero who cried out to God with his last breath. The horror became theater. These songs and stories were powerful. They taught generations what war was supposed to be. Young nobles trained with visions of Arthur's court in their minds. Kings justified wars by referencing sacred victories of the past. Even peasants, who bore the heaviest cost of war, found pride in hearing that their village's sons had fought alongside heroes. But the romanticization came with a price. Real suffering was erased. Those who had lived through the screams, the infections, the burning, their voices faded. The story that remained was cleaner, grander, and dangerously false. This was not always an accident. Kings wanted obedient warriors. Churches wanted believers to see divine justice in conquest. If the war was seen as noble, recruitment was easier. Taxes could be raised. Enemies could be dehumanized. Crusades could be launched. Not the First Crusade, for example, was wrapped in holy rhetoric. Chroniclers described rivers of infidel blood, and the joyous liberation of Jerusalem. They left out the charred children, the raped women, the infighting among Christian commanders. Later generations saw the Crusades as noble adventures, not what they really were: brutal, confused, and often catastrophic. Sometimes, the myth came before the battle. Leaders would announce their campaigns with grand speeches, invoking the glories of Alexander, the holiness of saints, the righteousness of their claim. The battle that followed had to live up to the legend. If it didn't, the chroniclers reshaped it until it did. Over time, even the worst atrocities gained a golden tint. The Battle of Agincourt, where English longbowmen slaughtered exhausted French knights, became a symbol of English valor, immortalized by Shakespeare. The Siege of Béziers, where thousands were massacred in the Albigensian Crusade, was remembered with the chilling phrase, "Kill them all, God will know his own." That line, recorded approvingly, became legend. These myths endured not just in words, but in places. Monuments were built, churches named after victorious saints, fields renamed, towns claimed lineage to heroes who may have never existed. The land itself became part of the legend, and as centuries passed, the brutality faded. The mud and blood gave way to reenactments, to festivals with lords in velvet cloaks and jesters juggling. War became a backdrop for pageantry. The very thing that had destroyed lives was now entertainment. This romantic vision of medieval war continues even today. Films show clean battles, brave charges, noble deaths. Rarely do they show the latrines, the disease, the mutilation, the screams of non-combatants caught in a siege. Games, novels, and TV shows borrow the imagery, but leave the horror behind. Yet, if we want to understand the medieval world, truly understand it, we must strip away the legend. We must return to the mud-soaked fields, to the broken villages, to the terrified eyes of a child watching his father conscripted. We must hear not just the song of the bard, but the silence of the widow, because behind every great medieval story lies a choice: to remember what was beautiful or to remember what was real. The thunder of war wasn't always on distant fields or grand campaigns. Sometimes it came to the village green, to the abbey door, to the very hearth of the home. Medieval battles, especially in the later centuries, blurred the line between soldier and civilian, between combat and crime. Violence didn't end at the edges of the battlefield. It often spilled over, uncontrolled, unpunished, and devastating. Though kings and commanders issued proclamations, drew borders, and signed truces, the reach of such declarations was limited. Outside the walls of castles and beyond the echo of cathedral bells, the real world functioned on survival. Raids and retaliations continued regardless of official treaties. Armies came and went, but chaos lingered. One of the darkest legacies of prolonged medieval warfare was the rise of free companies, bands of mercenaries who roamed the countryside in the vacuum between official campaigns. These men were experienced killers, often led by ambitious captains who held no allegiance beyond gold. When the war ended, their work didn't. They extorted villages, took over towns, and lived off the land violently. To many peasants, these rogue armies were worse than the wars themselves. Castles, while fortified, became both refuge and trap. For villagers, taking shelter inside might mean safety from a passing army, or becoming human shields in a siege. Lords often conscripted peasants for labor, making them build walls or dig moats under threat of punishment. Once a castle was surrounded, there was no escape. If the defenders surrendered, the besieging force might still slaughter everyone inside to make a point. Churches and monasteries, theoretically sacred, were looted with shocking frequency. Even kings ignored church protections when desperation set in. Gold crosses were melted, monks beaten for hiding relics, entire libraries set alight. The memory of scripture wasn't strong enough to resist the hunger for plunder. Civilian suffering was rarely collateral. It was part of the plan. By targeting food supplies, water sources, and homes, armies hoped to break morale and starve the enemy into submission. Fields were burned, not just for food denial, but as psychological warfare. A smoking landscape served as a warning. Resist, and this will be you. Women bore a particularly brutal burden. In times of peace, their roles were already bound by harsh expectations. In war, they became spoils. Rape was rampant, not just by enemy soldiers, but sometimes by their own men. Women fled into woods, disguised themselves as men, or threw themselves on the mercy of monasteries. Stories of mothers hiding with children in grain pits, of young girls taken and never seen again, were passed down in hushed voices. Children, too, became victims and witnesses. Orphaned, conscripted, enslaved. Some were forced to serve as pages or squires to knights, others scavenged from corpses. War distorted childhood, turning games into survival. In some rare cases, children were used as messengers or even hostages, political tools with little hope of return. Refugees crisscrossed the landscape, entire populations displaced. Carts creaked under makeshift shelters. Dogs barked nervously in unfamiliar fields. The lucky ones found shelter in other towns. The unlucky ones were turned away. Strangers meant risk, disease, or spies. Many died in transit. Exposure, starvation, and bandit attacks were constant threats. And always, there were the fires. A village burned quickly. Thatch roofs went up in minutes. Flames jumped from home to barn, from cottage to church. Smoke choked livestock. Fire became the final enemy, devouring everything that war had spared. Ash covered what had once been harvest. The legal system, such as it was, offered little hope. Lords prosecuted peasants for stealing food to survive. Mercenaries were sometimes hired as local enforcers. Complaints were ignored. Trials were unfair or non-existent. Violence begat more violence. Revenge killings, blood feuds, and neighbor betrayals rose in war's wake. Justice, if it came too late. Some kings set up traveling courts after campaigns, trying to reassert order, but the damage was done. Villages that once thrived turned into ghost towns. Others fell under the control of opportunistic bandits, who declared themselves lords and taxed travelers on the road to nowhere. And what of the soldiers? When the war moved on, many remained behind. Some married local women, blending into the community. Others kept looting, forming gangs that haunted the roads. A few tried to farm, but the skills of killing didn't plant wheat or repair plows. Religion tried to mend the cracks. Priests held mass graveside services. Penitents walked barefoot through ruined towns. Some monks blamed the chaos on God's punishment. Others begged for his mercy. Flagellants whipped themselves in bloody parades, hoping to turn divine wrath away. Stories lingered, they always do. Not the big noble ones, the small ones. A grandfather's tale of the stranger who saved him. A burned cross left standing when the rest of the village fell. A family heirloom, a spoon, a ring, a piece of chainmail, kept hidden, its story passed on. But the trauma endured too. Generation after generation grew up in a world shaped by not just one war, but by the echo of many. The brutality of battle never ended. It seeped into the stones of rebuilt walls, into lullabies sung over empty cradles, into the fear in a mother's eyes when the wind carried distant hoofbeats. Because in the medieval world, the real cruelty of battle wasn't just what happened when armies met, but what lingered after they left. There was a silent rhythm to medieval war, not just in the marches and the drums, but in the tolling of bells, the rustling of parchment, the creak of armor at dawn. Beneath the noise of battle was a structure, an invisible network that kept war moving. And at the center of that web were the war councils, where strategy was debated, alliances brokered, and fate sealed before a sword was ever drawn. The war council was the crucible in which every campaign was forged. It was where decisions were made about when to fight, where to march, whom to trust, and when to retreat. Gathered under tents, within castle halls, or in the shadowed sanctuaries of monasteries, commanders and advisors bent over maps drawn on stretched sheepskin. The maps were often crude, speculative guesses at best, shaped by hearsay, old pilgrim routes, and the occasional spy. Yet they were treated as gospel. These gatherings weren't democratic. The higher your birth, the louder your voice. Kings and dukes presided, while minor knights and captains stood at the edges, listening more than speaking. But even among the mighty, politics simmered. Old grudges festered, glory was currency, and nobody wanted to be left in the shadows of another man's triumph. Some councils began with prayers. A priest would call on divine favor, read a passage from Scripture, or hold aloft a relic to bind the lords to unity. Others opened with wine, a gesture of camaraderie that often led to shouting matches and broken goblets. Plans were laid, columns drawn, marching orders issued, scouts were sent. But the moment these plans left the tent, they began to unravel. Distance distorted communication. Weather ruined timetables. A bridge assumed to be intact might be destroyed. An ally counted on might fail to arrive. And at the heart of all these failures lay the fragile web of medieval loyalty. Feudal obligations were both glue and fault line. A baron might pledge troops to his king, but pull them back if a rival noble was favored. A captain might refuse orders if his village lay vulnerable. Loyalty wasn't just upward, it flowed sideways, tangled in personal ties and vendettas. Even the presence of the king could fracture rather than unite. A monarch's pride might lead to rash action. A general's caution might be mistaken for cowardice. Ambition clashed with pragmatism, and everyone knew if the battle was won, the king would claim the credit. If lost, the blame would be shared or deflected downward. Maps were dotted with hopeful markers. Rivers, hills, forests, imagined enemy positions. But there was always fog, not just the literal kind, but the fog of war, the unknown. What if the enemy had more men? What if a supply line was cut? What if the weather turned? Many councils gambled. They moved forward with hope, with prophecy, or with the reckless courage of those who believed their cause righteous. And when the plans failed, as they often did, the men in the tent were rarely the ones who paid the highest price. War councils also served another quieter purpose. Intelligence. Captured scouts were interrogated. Merchants were bribed. Messages intercepted. A single piece of false information could doom an entire campaign. And so, paranoia was constant. Some lords employed their own spies within the council, men who reported every word to another power. This espionage wasn't rare. It was expected. In some courts it was joked that a man should never speak freely near a fire, because even the flames might carry his words to an enemy's ear. Religious voices often held sway in these gatherings. Bishops and abbots didn't swing swords, but they wielded scripture. They urged action in the name of heaven, warned against fighting on holy days, or demanded the sparing of specific sites. Some commanders listened, others ignored them, until famine or plague gave their warnings a terrifying weight. War councils were also places of diplomacy. Treaties were whispered, secret marriages proposed, territories bargained. Sometimes a battle was avoided entirely because an emissary offered a better deal, or a threat too grave to ignore. More often, truces were made only to be broken days later, when advantage shifted. The personalities inside the council shaped the outcome. A cautious commander might save lives or miss opportunity. A bold one might win glory or lead a massacre. Some men rose to power through sheer charisma, others by fear. Many councils ended not with consensus, but with resignation, the quiet acceptance of a risky plan because time, supplies, or morale had run out. And always, outside the tent, soldiers waited. They sharpened blades, murmured rumors, made bets. Word of the council's decision would ripple through the camp like wildfire. Morale rose or fell on the whispers of "we march at dawn" or "the king is furious." Sometimes, news was manipulated. Commanders announced false victories to keep spirits high. Other times, plans were leaked on purpose to confuse spies, mislead the enemy, or justify a retreat as a tactical withdrawal. Truth was a weapon, as potent as any sword. The council also dealt with the aftermath. After a battle, especially a brutal or unexpected one, new councils were called. Supplies assessed, dead counted, survivors questioned, blame assigned. Sometimes a scapegoat was found, a noble demoted, a knight stripped of lands. Other times, silence reigned. No one wanted to revisit the decision that led to slaughter. Throughout the medieval era, war councils evolved. By the 14th and 15th centuries, more formal military hierarchies emerged. Professional soldiers began to outnumber feudal levies, but the essence of the council remained. Men in power, huddled around flawed maps, making decisions in smoke-filled chambers that would shape the fate of thousands. In these rooms, war was born not from bloodlust, but from ambition, fear, pride, and the desperate hope that this time, the plan would work. In the end, medieval battles weren't just events in the pages of history. They were shaping forces, violent storms that uprooted dynasties, reshaped borders, transformed landscapes, and scarred generations. The clash of sword and shield may have fallen silent centuries ago, but their echoes ripple still, in law, in language, in legend. What's left after the fighting ends? At first it's just debris, broken spears, scorched banners, rusting mail, fields turned to mud and blood, graves hurried, shallow, unmarked, dotting the periphery of conflict. But beyond the physical, there are deeper remnants. Trauma passed through families, stories that warp into myth, power shifts, laws rewritten, faith tested. The long arc of change becomes visible only after the smoke clears. The medieval battlefield was an evolving laboratory of death. By the 14th century, armor had grown bulkier, weapons more specialized, halberds to pierce plate, warhammers to crush helms. Siege engines gave way to cannon, and gunpowder began to shape not only tactics, but society itself. Old strongholds crumbled under the pressure of new ideas and new explosives. The knight, once the centerpiece of chivalric warfare, faded into the background. Romance would preserve his image, noble, honorable, solitary, but reality marched on. Armies grew professional. Infantry began to matter. Bowmen, gunners, pikemen, the age of aristocratic warfare gave way to something broader, more brutal, more total. But even as war changed, its cost remained. In lives, in land, in the souls of those who bore its weight. Many medieval battles had no clear victor. Strategic gains came at horrific human costs. Armies won a hill, only to starve on it. Kings gained crowns but lost sons. Peace was always temporary. The sword that carved a treaty today would be raised again tomorrow. And so the landscape adapted. Memorials rose. Fields once soaked in blood became pasture again. Churches sprouted near battlefields, not just as places of prayer, but as warnings. This ground was paid for in flesh, they seemed to say. Remember, but memory is slippery. Chroniclers shaped legacy with every stroke of the quill. The victor's version became the accepted truth. Opponents became villains. Failures were edited. Atrocities omitted. Whole towns might be erased from the record if their fate embarrassed the crown. Conversely, insignificant skirmishes could be inflated into grand epics if they flattered the right patrons. This manipulation shaped national identity. English pride swelled with tales of Agincourt and Crécy. French resilience found voice after defeats. Spanish unity rallied behind stories of the Reconquista. Myths became bricks in the foundation of kingdoms. Art and literature picked up the thread. Chronicles turned into romances. Death into destiny. Pain into poetry. By the 15th century, troubadours were already singing of noble sacrifice, while mothers still wept over empty cradles. These tales endure. They shape modern notions of bravery and warfare. We see them in film, in fantasy, in the symbols of nations. The lion rampant, the fleur-de-lis, the eagle, echoes of banners that once waved above carnage. But what about the people? The villagers forced to house soldiers, the girls raped in a night raid, the young boy who watched his father die, not on the field, but on a post-battle scaffold. Their stories, rarely told, vanish into the dirt. History prefers the roar of kings to the whispers of the broken. Yet, those whispers remain. In customs, in superstitions, in the wary glance of a town built behind stone walls. Some areas never fully recovered from what medieval war did to them. Whole valleys depopulated, trade routes redirected, languages lost, architecture changed to reflect not beauty, but defense. The church, too, evolved in response. After witnessing centuries of holy wars, it revised doctrine, emphasized peace, and reinterpreted earlier endorsements of violence. Monasteries kept records. Some preserved truth, others preserved propaganda, and both became part of the record. Law changed, military codes were refined, prisoners treated with new protocols. Even early Geneva-like conventions were born out of bitter experience and memory. The idea of rules in warfare began to form here. Don't kill the clergy, don't destroy crops, don't harm non-combatants. Not always followed, but planted. Technology born from war made its way into civilian life. Metallurgy improved farming tools, military roads improved trade, clockmaking, used for cannon timing, became a tool for monasteries and cities alike. War destroyed, yes, but it also pushed society into uneasy innovation. At the very end of the medieval period, the world stood poised on the edge of something new. Gunpowder, printing, exploration, the Renaissance. But beneath it all still pulsed the lessons of battle, the cost of power, the fragility of peace, the danger of myth. And now, centuries later, we walk through the shadows of those times. Tourists visit castle ruins. Children play in fields once wet with blood. Historians dig through soil and parchment, and stories like this one try to bridge the gap between what was and what is remembered. The brutality of medieval battles wasn't just in the slaughter, it was in the aftermath. The silence, the rewriting, the forgetting. But we can choose to remember, to listen, to see past the stained glass and pageantry and hear the hoofbeats, the screaming, the prayers, to honor not just the nobles on their war horses, but the nameless ones who died unseen and unremembered. That's the final truth of these wars. They weren't fought for us, but they shaped the world we inherited. Thank you for staying with me on this long journey. If this brought you insight, or comfort, or simply helped you rest tonight, I'm grateful. Please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the overlooked corners of history. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Until we meet again, rest well